Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
A large number of rural Wyomingites lack access to high-speed broadband, and often the internet that rural Wyomingites can access is slower and more expensive than it is for their big city counterparts. How does that impact rural Wyoming's future? What is the state of broadband in Wyoming? We'll examine the issue next on Wyoming Chronicle.
Funding for this program is made possible in part by the Wyoming Humanities Council, helping Wyoming take a closer look at life through the humanities, thinkwy.org, and by the members of the Wyoming PBS Foundation. Thank you for your support.
And as we begin our discussion on Wyoming Chronicle this evening on the state of broadband in Wyoming, we have a wonderful panel here to discuss the issue, and I'd like to introduce them now. Brian Worthen is the CEO of Gillette-based Visionary Broadband. Kristin Lee is the Director of State Regulatory and Legislative Affairs at CenturyLink, and Representative Albert Sommers, a Republican from Sublette County and is a member of the state's Broadband Council. Thank you all for sharing your time with us this evening. And I want to start right there. What is the Broadband Council? Brian, let me start with you, and we'll just kind of go down the line and learn about what the Broadband Council is in Wyoming and why it's important.
Yeah, the Broadband Advisory Council was formed after there were funds put into broadband or put towards broadband. And so the Advisory Council was formed to hand out those funds, to evaluate applications, to determine need, and to advise the Business Council on how best to distribute those funds to impact the state.
Companies are represented, people around the state. It's really a diverse group, and it's, they've come together, they've given a lot of time, and they've really hit the ground running. It's been quite remarkable.
And Representative Sommers, your role on the Broadband Council is what?
As a liaison to the council. So I'm not a voting member. I'm just there to listen, provide input, and if there's legislative issues to come back. And really, this all started with one bill. The Broadband Advisory Council also created a broadband plan for Wyoming. And a mapping effort. So, one thing we want to look at is where do we have broadband, what kind of broadband, where do we have it in the state of Wyoming? So my job is to simply sit there, listen, provide comment, and take that back to the legislature so they understand what's going on and then if there's legislation.
And Wyoming isn't the only state, I'm sure, that's concerned about rural broadband access.
Everyone's concerned about rural broadband. It's a part of every presidential campaign now, every gubernatorial campaign, mayoral campaign. It's the hot topic, and rural broadband specifically, because of the digital divide, is the term commonly used.
So if I were to ask you what the goals are of the Broadband Council, what would you tell me?
Really is to advise the Business Council on how best to manage these funds. But as Albert said, the broadband plan that was formulated about a year ago actually allowed Wyoming to obtain additional points under the USDA financing or grant program that is called Reconnect. So the work done by the Advisory Council and towards this plan actually helped Wyoming gain points, and there were funds distributed by the USDA.
And significant funds, I should say,
yes.
For sure, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But how big of a deal is this for Wyoming? I've got to believe with Wyoming's A, lack of market, B, geographic challenges, this is a problem. Kristin, do you have a feel for that?
Oh, it's a fabulous program. I think it's not only identifying where we have broadband, it's to identify where we don't and where it doesn't meet the minimum speeds. And there are pockets that are not served, or we call it underserved, but really not served, doesn't meet the standard. And so those are areas that are uneconomic for private industry to invest in. And so, and we as you invest more and more in the urban areas, and then less and less as it becomes more expensive in the rural areas. Mm-hmm. So when you get down to where it's uneconomic to invest, then that's the role for the the state funds to invest and to help invest in those areas. So it's a huge deal. It may not be very many people, and it may be very small percentage-wise, but it's really the people, the areas, the residences, and maybe some businesses, but mostly residential, that just are uneconomic for private industry to serve.
So if you were to tell me how many people aren't served today like they could be or should be, do we know what that number is?
Not really.
Is it 20% of Wyoming doesn't have adequate, 30%?
Oh gosh, no.
More than that or less than
No,
that?
much less than that.
Yeah?
Much less than that, yeah.
So what does it mean to have good broadband access? What are your numbers goals?
That's a debate.
Okay, all right, we can learn about that now.
I would contend that it's the ability to use internet and not have to worry about your speed. I would contend that you have sufficient broadband when you can have a video call, connect to the cloud, conduct your business, use internet apps, and not notice a problem.
Representative Sommers, what are your issues with what is an appropriate speed? Is that a good definition?
I think Brian's definition is really a good one. The question is, for government programs, what is the appropriate speed? And I think that's where we've debated and often not agreed on what is a minimum speed. And frankly, to me, for a business, it's gig.
1 gigabit service, up and down?
No, I don't think so. I don't think you need to be up and down, but I think it has to be around that. And even now for private homes, a lot, one of the great expansions we could have in Wyoming is home-based business, and home-based and a home-based economy where the employee is in a house and he works online in any city in the nation. I think we have the attributes in this state that people want to be here, but they can't be where their job is. And I think eventually that divide is going to go away, and it really will go away if we have what Brian suggested. When you sit down at the internet and you do your thing on the internet, you don't even know you're on the internet. There's no latency. It's seamless. And I think that is where you want to be in Wyoming. Getting there, the challenge for these folks is it's not economic to provide that to 3 people in, the far end of Sublette County, right?
To your ranch.
Yeah, to my ranch, for example. And so I think that's the challenge, is how do we as a society enable these people, these folks, these industries to get those speeds out there in a way that doesn't bias one against another, and makes it fair.
Is there a focus then? Is it a congruent focus, residential versus business? Is that the same thing in the council's eyes, or is that a different problem? Something for residential, something for business? Do we know?
Most of the focus on the Broadband Advisory Council is around residential. That's what we hear most from, is residential users, and it's because of this divide and because of this inability to compete. It obviously ekes into small business and starts affecting larger business. There's a number of communities around the state that have no route redundancy. They have no protection.
And just route redundancy is that if a fiber is cut here, you're out of service. Is that what you're talking about?
Correct. If there's route redundancy, there's a second option for that community to route. So you think about hospitals, and you think about radiology. You think about a hospital scanning a broken bone and sending that off to somewhere else. If it's at the wrong time and there's not that infrastructure that exists, it will delay the outcome. It will delay the treatment in this case. And there's a number of examples like that. So the Broadband Advisory Council is obviously focused on the whole ecosystem. And what's most interesting, and we've been in this business a long time, since the dawn of the internet, 25 years. The bottom line is Wyoming is a unique market because it's so rural, and it's, as people say, it's a big city that's just with long streets. You have to take all the demand, whether it's small business, residential, large business, and put it on one network and service all those customers. You can't specialize in residential, you can't specialize in business.
How does, for instance, the Broadband Council evaluate need maybe in Star Valley or in Kemmerer or in Cheyenne? what are your parameters for evaluating where is the best place to spend money or to suggest to spend money?
Well,
Kristin?
Craig, the statute really took a hard look at that. And this was a couple years ago. And the statute said it had to be a gig in business corridors, just like Representative Sommers said. That was the standard. And then to residential, it was 10 megs down and 1 meg up. And then in a very short period of time, that was up to 25 meg down and 3 meg up. So that's the standard statutorily. I agree with Brian and his definition, but I think from a government perspective, they have to define it somehow so that we have these standards so that we can start to look at it. So now it's 25 meg down and 3 meg up, and where that doesn't exist, then that is considered unserved. So that's statutory. If you're going to be in the world of the Broadband Advisory Council, giving government money to these public-private partnerships is how it's styled, then that's the standard.
So let's talk about the role of the federal government in that effort. Certainly the FCC and others, the Department of Agriculture, are very involved in this. To what extent?
So both the USDA has had a program for years that has funded rural activity, whether it was voice and then it later became broadband. They have programs called Reconnect. They already handed out money in a first round. They have programs called Community Connect grants. There are always programs being funded because it helps rural America, it helps ranches, it helps farms. And then the FCC also has programs too.
So let me ask you a quick question, and then I'll let you expand on the FCC. Do you have to wait for a private provider to come to you and ask for this money to then provide the service? Is that how this process works, or no?
It's different for every entity. The Wyoming statute defined the process as pairing up a community with a provider. So it is a public-private partnership. In the case of the USDA, it's a grant program, or it's a grant plus loan program. We actually participate in a USDA program that's a loan guarantee program, and it's designed for providers. Same with the FCC. They have programs like Connect America Fund 2. They have an upcoming Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which is commonly called RDOF, and those are actually grant programs or reverse auctions that fund directly to the provider to help rural areas and areas without sufficient broadband.
You see the role the same?
Oh, absolutely, I do, yeah. And my company participates at the very, very beginning of these in the modeling and identifying the areas. This program, the RDOF that Brian referenced, will be at a very, very granular level to the premise, actually, where a broadband doesn't exist to address this digital divide. And so then the companies will evaluate where it makes sense to bid for those funds in a reverse auction. And it'll be based on what speeds you bid and how much you bid.
So it's competitive.
Oh, it's be very competitive.
Sure.
It'll be competitive among technology. It'll be competitive among providers. And then the FCC will decide the most efficient use of its money to bring services to those areas.
You both represent providers, so I'll ask Representative Sommers, does Wyoming have a sufficient number of providers to access these funds to further grant rural access?
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, it's always good to have more competition in the field, but I think we have a pretty hungry group of providers. And the one thing I want to comment on the federal funds, state funds. The federal funds, they can grant straight to a provider. State of Wyoming, we can't do that because we have a constitutional requirement that government cannot go straight to an individual or straight to a corporation. And there's ways we work through that if it has a public good and a public benefit, but we're under more constraints than the federal government. I do want to say one thing and I'm hoping this round of federal government funding is different than in the past, and I think it is, because in the past, frankly, there were too many strings attached to the federal dollars. And you take the CAF 2 fund, there's CAF 1 funding, and there was a whole bunch of leftover because, frankly, it couldn't be used. Providers couldn't meet the needs or the demands or the strings involved in it. And I think that's where I struggle at time with industry, is at the national level they have kind of put a pressure on the strings on that money, and I think not always for the benefit of the citizen.
To elaborate on something Albert just said, and you asked the question, are there sufficient providers in the state? What's happening in the last 3 to 5 years is there's a new breed of provider, and I think we're one of those. There's a provider that's been encouraged to develop more broadband. They see programs like the Broadband Advisory Council program where funds are handed out at the state level in partnership with the community. They see programs from the USDA and the FCC. And in the most recent FCC reverse auction, a number of providers stepped up and received hundreds of millions of dollars that were emboldened. They said, we can do this. And historically, those roles have been filled by the cable company and the telephone company. But what you're seeing now is other providers stepping up the plate, and they're what I would call new builders. They're people now constructing the networks of the future. And what's most interesting is we're working in conjunction with the phone companies and the cable companies because it's a shared infrastructure. And Wyoming is like that. Our infrastructure must be shared. We can't all individually build service to the end of the road in Pinedale.
What is a reasonable expectation when people see ads in other markets for gigabit service at this amount or this speed at that amount? Will Wyoming's, service always be a little more expensive and a little more challenging because of some of the things that you all just talked about? Is that an unreasonable comment? Do we know? Maybe yes?
Well, I'm from CenturyLink's perspective, and that's my company. We're a national and international company, so we charge the same in Wyoming as that we charge anywhere else, Craig. So it's an average price. In fact, if you were to be completely technical about it, we would be, the urban areas, the more urban states would actually be subsidizing.
Sure.
So, because we're not, our pricing isn't that granular. So that's from our perspective. And I really want to just say one thing. I really appreciate what Brian said about the interconnectedness of all the providers in Wyoming and how we carry each other's traffic and how we have contracts between each other, because I don't think any one provider could do it. It's really quite remarkable. So, but as far as the pricing goes, it just depends.
How about our schools? Are they connected like they should be statewide? Or do we know?
The state has done a really great job at expanding access to schools.
Best in the nation.
Best in the nation.
Yes.
For connectivity?
Yep.
That's surprising.
Per student. Best
How's that measured? How do we know that?
Bandwidth per student. It's measured bandwidth per student. And it's been unbelievable. It's been since the Wyoming Education Network and now the Unified Network. And it's been a huge commitment put forth by the legislature and the executive branch to build the finest education network in the country.
It is.
I don't think that we're overstating it.
No, I really don't think we are. I think by everybody's count, we're number one.
When
Go ahead.
the legislature funded a 100 gig ring, that was the start of expanded bandwidth to a student. Before it was measured in tens of percents and 50%. And that's when it really dramatically increased. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded a program called the Education Superhighway. And they measured that. And we were neck and neck with Hawaii, and we came out on top. But it's pretty unusual for our state in a rural environment to receive that kind of recognition. I think it is, to build on what Kristin just said, it's a collaboration, legislature, providers, large providers, small providers. There's still one-room schoolhouses, and those students are still receiving, or are now today receiving, the correct speed. Is
it an adequate assumption then that because of the focus on schools, then those nearby communities, as small as they might be, have benefited?
I think so, absolutely.
Is there a relationship there? Do we know?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Give me an example, maybe.
You take my community, would be one when the Unified Network came through, CenturyLink, frankly, had to put fiber through the town. So, maybe not everybody got to be on that fiber, but it provided more opportunities than it had before for particularly institutions, I think. So, I think absolutely. There is one caveat I want to say on the whole I think in the schools, we're best in the nation. But then the kids go home, right? Kids go home and they go out, and can they do their homework out in rural Wyoming? They can at school, but can they do it in their home? And I think that's still remains a challenge in some areas of kids being able to get on the internet. And then frankly, you have this bulge at 5 o'clock, right? You get all these kids, you all get all these kids on the internet at 4 or 5 o'clock with their parents, and then you can't get all that bulge through the system and your speeds start to drop. And so I think there's still challenges that we need to work on. But certainly at the school level, I think we've done a remarkable job.
Let's look into the future just a little bit. What are we working on now? And let's start from the state perspective. What is the more work that needs to be done in your eyes, Representative Sommers?
You know, and these folks probably hate for me to say this, but you know, I think the internet, I don't know if they will, I think the internet has become an essential service, just like the phone was at one time, just like electricity is. We may laugh at that, right? Because you need electricity to have the internet. But the internet has now become so critical to people's everyday lives, whether it's communication, whether it's doing your banking, whether it's doing your job, your books, whatever. We are down that path, and it's not coming back. And so I think our challenge is, how do we reach the last remote places in Wyoming? How do we reach my ranch? How do we reach, I can think of a number of places.
The child who goes home after a 30 or 40 minute bus ride, who can't
Yep.
access. Mm-hmm.
And not only that, but then how do we reach the poor children in the communities? Because just because we have good internet somewhere doesn't mean that that child has internet in his home. And so I think we have some challenges left, and I don't know how we as society will handle them, but I can tell you what, as far as the technology, and I'd let these guys speak to it, but the technology is going to evolve, and we don't know where it's going to evolve to. I mean, we could be, we have these low orbit Earth satellites, right? And will that become a thing or not a thing? I don't know. Mm-hmm. I don't know if we know where it's going to go.
But it's worthwhile to think about that. Do we have an opinion about these things? We've all heard the stories that Amazon and others are having maybe these satellites that are in the air that will give everyone broadband access. 5 years out, 30 years out, we don't know. We don't care. We're just moving forward. How do you look at that?
I see it as opportunity. I see us with a horizon that's undefined, and we look at broadband in phases. And so within our company, we actually carve it up as what we can do in the next year, what we can do in the next 3 years. And it's difficult to look 10 years, 20 years down the road. I often tell people I don't even know how my kids are going to use the internet when they're in their career. But I know that we're building pipes. I know that the conduit we're placing in the ground, the connectivity we're building to towers, combined will improve that service. But we carve that up into phases. And a phase approach is necessary for folks like Albert at the end of the dirt road. Looking in the future, highly difficult, and it requires quite a bit of capital. And so again, I see opportunity because the FCC, the USDA, the state of Wyoming, there's going to be other funding that comes down the road because we're in a different environment. Everybody sees over the fence and sees what internet is sold for in Denver and Phoenix and Seattle. And it's easy to know what you are lacking. But I would contend we need to work together, and we need to have more discussions. We need to have discussions within our communities, within our city councils, within our county commissioners, because the cost of putting infrastructure in the ground is the most costly portion of broadband. Sure. And there's got to be a collective effort to solve that. How it's going to be used in the future doesn't matter.
The capacity that's going to be needed in the future for internet, you can't even believe what it's going to be. I mean, you can't even think about it almost because, like you said, these guys still got to put stuff in the ground to get it done, and it's going to be so much stuff out there, so many gigs needed that how are we going to do that? So it's not just how do we keep rural Wyoming going right now, but how do we keep it competitive 20 years from now, 30 years from now? And these people are going to have an awesome responsibility and an awesome task ahead of them to get that done. And I wish them luck.
Well, for sure, but I worry then that rural Wyoming is at more risk to be left behind in many of the things that you're talking about.
You know, Craig, I think we always have to address the digital divide. We are always going to do it, but we're seeing a commitment from the federal government. Brian just listed
Sure.
them off, and the state. And I think we do have people who absolutely can see this. And the technology is changing so much, and there are new providers in the ecosystem. And so I think that, you know, they're starting. It's not just Wyoming that's rural,
Sure.
right? It's It's everywhere. It has rural pockets that are expensive,
But especially the West, I would say.
uneconomic, you know, and it's a worldwide network too. So
Sure.
lots of third world countries that, you know, are pretty well served because different technologies are doing
Sure.
it.
As we wrap up the program in the next 1 year to 18 months, what should state residents expect from the Broadband Council? If they were watching you, what are they going to see?
More communication, more education, availability, mapping, what we're doing to be competitive.
Kristin, and I'm sure people can reach out to your company as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the Broadband Advisory Council is going to be a really trusted resource for people to go and see all the providers, the speeds, look at the mapping, be able to drill down on the map and see what's available. And I think it's a fabulous resource supported by the state, not any one company, and for people to go and look at it, take a look at it and use it. And you can access the providers right there and ask your questions. And yeah, it's a great resource.
Final thoughts, Representative Sommers?
I think the Broadband Council provides a forum for some really hard conversations. And it's not always comfortable to any member of it, right? But so, for example, telehealth. How do we get telehealth around the state of Wyoming without stepping on everybody's toes but still accomplishing what we want? We have to have those hard conversations. And I think that provides a forum for the industry, the public, and towns and counties to all sit at the table and go, let's have these hard conversations.
Brian Worthen, Kristin Lee, and Representative Albert Sommers, thank you so much for joining us on Wyoming Chronicle.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
us, Craig.
Yeah, enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Funding for this program is made possible in part by the Wyoming Humanities Council, helping Wyoming take a closer look at life through the humanities, thinkwhy.org, and by the members of the Wyoming PBS Foundation. Thank you for your support.